It is Friday, January 3rd. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another 2025 episode of LTPS. It is officially the new year, and that means we have more news stories. It's already heating right back up, so we've got a decent amount to talk about this week. So let's begin, as always, with our PS Plus reminder. If you have not just yet claimed the final 2024 PS Plus Essential lineup games before they go away, this coming Tuesday on the 7th, it's going to change over to Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League on PlayStation 5, the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe PS4, PS5, and Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered on PlayStation 4. I've not played that Need for Speed, but I do love that franchise, so seems like a decent pick there. Stanley Parable, fantastic game, super cool, quirky, very funny. Just jump in, play the game, experience it as blind as possible. And then Kill the Justice League. I mean, my God, less than a year, right? We've already got this game available on subscription. They've already announced that they're done adding new content, but they are going to be adding some offline modes. So a very sort of appropriate offering, even though the circumstance is not exactly ideal for what is a game that clearly fell flat on its face. Perhaps a little bit too late. I don't know, I have no interest in this game. I'm sure a lot of people also don't really have that much interest as well, considering the circumstance it's in. But that is one way to start off the new year, as a game that is basically going to die soon. Although the offline modes are certainly helpful. I wish more games sort of had that kind of sunset if they're going to be not receiving content updates anymore. Anyway, moving on to our first news story here, we have a lot of Sony personnel this past week that were providing interviews and just discussing the PlayStation business, things like that. So in this case, we have one example from Stephen Tottilo's newsletter GameFile, where he was speaking with Hiromi Wakai, who is the vice president of SIE's product management, and they were talking about the PlayStation Portal, where we learned some interesting facts about the device. Maybe not that surprising, but it turns out the peak time people are playing on their Portal is 9 p.m., which is an hour of the peak time playing directly on PS5 consoles. So this does suggest that people are playing on the console first in, say, one room, and then using the Portal late at night in another room where the family might be using the TV or something like that. So Hiromi Wakai went on to say, and I quote here, "Players who own a PS Portal tend to spend more time playing games than those who don't. Of course, it's likely that users who purchase PS Portal were naturally more engaged in the first place. However, our data shows that PS Portal owners tend to spend more time playing games compared to non-owners." Wakai also went on to talk about how they wanted to go slow with the software updates, so they were always planning to add cloud streaming, but they wanted to take incremental steps based on community reception and feedback, which makes sense. I mean, it's something where we were all kind of expecting the device is going to get that at some point, so it got it within the first year. I imagine by the end of this year, we'll probably be in a circumstance where the cloud streaming is really fleshed out to where it's hopefully the entire PS Plus streaming catalog, and then also being able to access games that are not in the catalog, but you can just still, if you have it in your digital library, typically you can still stream those games if you are a premium member, obviously. But still, it's a matter of that's likely where the device will end up being. And then it's not surprising per se, but clearly you're going to be a very engaged customer that is probably getting a lot more mileage out of the Portal, which that is the use case that they proposed this thing as, was being able to use it outside of the your primary playroom, living room, things like that. Later in the day, family using the TV, something like that. It is really fascinating seeing the Portal turn into this device, which, by and large, is not a multi-million seller. The metric that we think this thing is probably around, as far as the lifetime sales for it, is in the few low millions relative to the entire PS5 install base. But it's likely a lot more than what a lot of people and Sony themselves were thinking. So it has indeed found its audience, and there are still so many people where they live and die by their Portal. They love it, and they love the use case that it presents them. And I also have really enjoyed the Portal too. I don't use it a ton because I'm a little bit more sensitive to the input latency. I can absolutely feel it in a lot of very fast, kinetic-paced games. So if I'm going to play something that's a little bit more slow, then typically I like doing that on the Portal because I love handheld play. So the Portal, by and large, I do enjoy the use case for it, but it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution for me. But either way, it still seems like a device that has really surprised not only customers, but also Sony themselves. Moving on to some game news here, starting off with Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, where it didn't really take long at all, but the trailer shows up, and then fans are now doing some digging on this game, trying to find out something about it, and so there's been recent discoveries where now there's a lot of speculation as to if this game is going to have a lot of horror elements in it. So initially this was researched by the YouTube channel Jonastic and then reposted on the Gaming Leaks and Rumors subreddit, where it was found that Ty Martinez, an artist that specializes in cinematic horror and thriller concepts, started doing freelance for Naughty Dog back in at least March of 2024, which you look at their portfolio and it's just primarily that, which is a lot of spooky, eerie looking, otherworldly images and concept art and things like that. A lot of really cool stuff. And then Colin Lorimer, a visual artist who worked on the game as well, they posted the trailer on Instagram and they had the hashtag on there for horror. So a very minor thing, but people are trying to piece these things together and come to this conclusion of like, oh, maybe they're going to put a lot more horror elements in this game than, prior titles that Naughty Dog has done, which, you think of The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, my mind immediately goes to like the Pittsburgh basement or the hospital Rat King sequence. These games do have a lot of very spooky, unsettling, horror-esque moments. I wouldn't say that they're the primary focus of those games, but they do have their moments where it does feel like that. In the case of Intergalactic, I mean, there's so many unknowns for the game. The first trailer, I think, was good enough as far as, sort of satiating the appetite of here's a Naughty Dog new IP. It's a completely different thing. We've got clear inspirations from Akira and Cowboy Bebop, and there's many other little things trickled throughout the trailer that people are trying to piece together. But the planet itself, right? The planet where the entire concept is bounty hunter goes to this planet. It's a planet known for people not being able to leave it. We didn't see a lot of that. We got one giant robot enemy, and that's pretty much it. I mean, what is the moment-to-moment gameplay really like for this title, where Naughty Dog is openly saying this is the most they've focused on the gameplay department? We've got prior comments about it feeling very open, and there's a lot of player choice or being inspired by FromSoft games. Is it going to be a scenario where once you're plopped on this planet, there's really no set guidelines as far as where you have to go, no waypoints, no markers, just sort of explore at your leisure? And it does have a lot of these otherworldly creatures that are a clear inspiration from this particular artist's work. That's sort of where my head goes, and so I'd like to see more of that. I think it's fun to have these little examples pop up, and it's like, oh, what does this mean? Well, I think they maybe will want to explore this in a deeper way. I mean, they do have horror elements that underpin those prior two games. With The Last of Us, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we'll see more of that in this one. Next up, we've got some concept art and designs and also a description of what are two live service games that were canceled by SIE, or more specifically, they were in development at Firesprite. So this was spotted by the Game Post from a former lead artist at Firesprite. And so the first set of images that we can look at here are from a post-apocalyptic game described as live service. The game was in development on UE5, but was ultimately canceled. A lot of the images are just showing off worn down looking weapons, but the artist did describe the role as being the lead of vehicles and weapons. So the speculation here is that this was the Twisted Metal project. Now, the second set of images that we can look at are from a now canceled free-to-play Battle Royale game with a vibrant sci-fi look. This project was handed over to another studio after 18 months when the IP was sold, and from there it saw several stylistic changes. Both these games we were following on LTPS for quite a while, more so the Twisted Metal project. I think that one was aired out just a little bit more, given that we heard it was at Lucid, then handed over to Firesprite, and then somewhat recently was canceled internally at SIE. So we never actually got a formal announcement of that game. It just wasn't really shaping up or going in any sort of meaningful direction. The sci-fi sort of free-to-play Battle Royale game, we heard almost nothing about that game. It was a lot of job listings, more or less telling us that's what Firesprite was doing, which if I remember correctly, I'm not even sure if that game was like, it might have always been in development at Firesprite up until SIE then acquired the studio, and maybe that's where it just didn't really pan out, and they just said, you know what, we'll just move this thing somewhere else. So now I'm curious as to where that game is, what it looks like, if we know exactly what that game is, and if it will end up seeing the light of day. But we should always remember that for Firesprite, while it's interesting that we saw these things, right now, the short term, we're still expecting Project Heartbreak, which is, all signs are pointing to that game probably being an Until Dawn sequel, which we might see that game actually get announced this year, if anything, considering the Until Dawn movie is supposed to be coming out this year as well. So they might want to line that up in some way. As far as like short-term announcements, we might be seeing that from Firesprite, but it was interesting to see some kind of remnants from the Twisted Metal game, because it's one of those things where canceled projects are never that fun, but it happens all the time. And usually it takes a while before we start learning more about the history behind that project. But in this case, we might have actually got to see a little bit more of it sooner than we would have thought. Moving on to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and its sales, where we've got another update and comment on where the game is, how well is it doing. This has been such a contentious topic, considering that with Rebirth and 16 and these games still selling millions, but also Square has historically been saying with any game they put out that they don't really meet their sales expectations. Why are they not giving a number for Rebirth? It's been an ongoing thing, obviously, and these games are exclusive to PlayStation for a set amount of time, I should say. But in this case, we do have, it was the director Naoki Hamaguchi and producer Yoshinori Kitase speaking with IGN Brazil for the Game Awards 2024, and they talked about the sales for Rebirth and provided a very candid comment on the topic where they say, and I quote here, "In terms of sales expectations, Sony held the PlayStation Partner Awards in Japan, and there was a category in which they awarded the 3 best-selling games. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was one of them, alongside Black Myth Wukong and Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. So I think being recognized in this aspect gives me the certainty that we have reached a certain level. While we are confident and happy that we are reaching a certain level of sales, it is clear that with modern games, we cannot be exclusive to a single platform. I think we need to offer the game to as many players as possible." You know, at this point, they're really not at liberty to say anything all that new or different from what we heard from the Square president with, this game, as far as like, oh, it sold fine or just okay, but they're not providing a sales milestone. And also they're openly saying that we'll go multi-plat for most games going forward, but we still don't know how, to the degree of how they can do that with this particular franchise, given that 7 Remake and then Rebirth and possibly the third entry do have some kind of agreement with Sony that extends well beyond just the 1-year PC thing. And so who knows how long it will take to satisfy that agreement, and then they can start shipping elsewhere. But of course, the entire aspect of exclusivity for a third party is that, they are being paid enough to offset the potential sales that they would have seen from other platforms. The PC release for 16, unfortunately, did not really do all that well from what we were seeing, a few 100,000 something units. We don't have an exact number. It's just sort of guesstimates, basically, but it didn't really light the world on fire, which is probably problematic for Square. I think one could easily argue the series is not going to move the needle that much further on Xbox. Now, Nintendo, there's probably a lot of upside if they can start shipping the franchise on the next lineup of Nintendo hardware, or if they can reasonably get something running on the Switch with the existing install base. But again, as far as the contract and what they're able to satisfy, they might not be able to do that for a very long time. There's still just a lot of debate around, well, the franchise is just not really what it used to be. A sequel is also inherently not going to do as good as the outgoing one. Also, 7 Remake with the late lifecycle PS4 install base during COVID, where people are time rich and they're spending a lot in the entertainment space. Conceivably, there's no way they were ever going to match the sales pace of that game anyway, so there's just so many things that's already been said about this franchise, but it does seem clear that they might have gotten the short end with the exclusivity agreement, where maybe they were just not paid enough, and it would have cost a lot more to satisfy Square in the same manner as them wanting to hopefully sell as many units as they possibly can. Next up, we've got what I would consider to be the first big, substantial, in clear view evidence that is real on paper for possible PlayStation 3 emulation. That is right. So this was recently spotted on Implicit Conversion's website. Implicit Conversions, of course, is the company that Sony contracts out for the PS1, PSP, and now PS2 classics on PlayStation Plus Premium and on the PlayStation Store. They're the ones primarily that do this with their Syrup emulation engine. And so recently on their site, under the Syrup engine roadmap, under the Dreaming About category, so not released, not in progress, Dreaming About, and it's listed right there, PlayStation 3 emulator, researching and prototyping the possibility of a PS3 emulator package for Syrup. Now, of course, some very big caveats with this. It's Dreaming About. It's not even actively in progress, something that they would probably like to do at some point down the road. This is primarily what this company does, is emulating older titles. And they don't just work with Sony, although as far as I know, I think Sony is like their biggest client that gives them the most consistent work, and that's how they're primarily paid. I mean, they've done a lot of different projects and separate releases on like the Switch and PC and things like that. So that's what they do. They're independent. and that's how they find work, is offering up this emulation engine, all these features with their emulator package, pitching to studios that, hey, you don't need source code, we can also add trophies and achievements, and so that is their model, right? I think Sony is their biggest client, though, so it's a really weird thing where it's like, of course, with what they do, they would like to emulate as many machines as possible, and therefore that opens up the catalog and the pitches they can make. They do have a very good relationship with Sony, but it's really important to distinguish that, you know, Sony contracts them out. They're not owned by Sony, and really they have their own model as far as like why they choose to do these things. But with that said, I mean, it's at least the first tangible thing out in the open, because for as long as I've been doing LTPS, I can tell you, like, there's not really been credible rumors. The only time this has ever happened was Jeff Grubb from Giant Bomb, who is often seen as credible. He mentioned that he had heard that this is actually coming, but of course he's not going to outline where he heard that from, or, you know, what source that's dialing back to. Outside of the one time where Jeff Grubb said something, I can assure you this has not been rumored. There has been nothing credible in the landscape of possible PlayStation 3 emulation that we can somehow tie back to maybe it showing up on PlayStation hardware. And the thing I've always said, which is very real, is that if it is happening, it would take a very long time. This would not be overnight. It would be a multi-year process for a new emulator. You can look at the RPCS3 team and see how long it takes to see some decent results, fantastic results even. I often want to point out that they do incredible work as a group of hobbyists, but the second you have to monetize it and turn it into a business, and it has to go through QA, and you have to dig up old licenses again and try to get it recertified for the store. It's a very different kind of thing to start monetizing backwards compatibility and emulating old titles. So PlayStation 3 would go through a lot of hoops, barriers of entry. I would still argue that PS5 CPU is not going to give it enough headroom to reliably emulate a lot of, you know, CPU-bound PlayStation 3 games or titles that heavily lean into the cell processor. It's going to be a very mixed bag, but it's still encouraging to see Implicit Conversions, the company that has a good relationship with Sony for restoring classics on PlayStation 4 and 5, that they are thinking about doing this or looking into it further, and maybe we will someday be in a position where this will happen, likely on PlayStation 6. I mean, I don't know if that's like way too soon to say, but considering we're this far into the PS5 lifecycle, every sort of thing I've already tallied off with the issues for PS3 emulation and certainly on console, that seems like the most realistic thing, which I'm surprised, if anything, that it would end up happening this way. I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? If we're talking about this theoretical future where we finally get PS3 emulation that's available on PlayStation hardware, considering how complicated PS3 could be, if Sony was that committed to getting it done in their own interest of like finally retiring PS3 server blades as an example, and being able to have local playback on their consoles and potentially later server blades that they develop, which ideally you'd still want to do this on PS5 hardware to some degree. That way you can install these executables on PS5 server blades that they now have and they recently deployed. But I would have assumed that, it maybe would have made more sense for Sony to do this emulator in-house because they have PS3 source code. They know the console better than anybody. And so, it would have just maybe accelerated the process a bit further to where that would be the solution, and not having a separate company reverse engineer and do it themselves for their own interest than to then pitch it to Sony. Or maybe Sony's involved. Maybe there's that conversation is starting. And, engineers are helping Implicit Conversions out, and it's all speculation on my part. The reality is we do have something that is tangible in front of us, which is this company is looking into it and dreaming about it. We're all dreaming about it. But for as long as I've told people it's not coming, if it is, this is how it would play out. Well, there you go. This is how it's playing out. It still might be a while, but we might soon finally be in a place where we get PS3 emulation on a very curated title-by-title basis, but maybe it'll happen. All right, moving on to more SIE interviews from this past week. We have two from Famitsu, where they were speaking with both Hideaki Nishino, the CEO of the Platform Business Group, and Hermen Hulst, the CEO of the Studios Business Group. A lot of really cool things coming out of this, some interesting quotes and anecdotes and things about PlayStation history. So I'll cherry pick some of the more pertinent items out of here. So for Hermen Hulst, when he was asked about one game in particular that was important for the growth of PlayStation over the last 30 years, Hermen said, in his opinion, it was Uncharted 2, saying that until then, games always liked to specialize in graphics, story, game design, things like that. And during that time, he was working on Killzone 3 with Mark Cerny supporting as a consultant. But when he saw Uncharted 2, namely, it just raised the standard in production since they were trying to meet that criteria for Game of the Year, and it really changed that criteria with that game in particular. That's at least what he thought for that game. Now, speaking directly on Concord and studio closures and the rapidly changing business, Hermen said that going forward, they will continue to focus on developing live service games along with story-driven single-player titles, as in the language here has not changed whatsoever from every single time they are asked this particular question, still doing live service, still doing single-player. And they did mention that they've learned a lot from, of course, mentioning Helldivers 2. They're always going to name drop the success here and sort of brush past Concord and studio closures. So very PR buttoned up answer there. And then on the topic of mobile, he also says that they want to maximize synergy with console and says their first focus is on collaborations with external development studios, referencing the strategic partnership with NCSoft or Destiny Rising, the mobile Destiny game from NetEase. So more or less admitting that the internal Neon Koi thing not really panning out. So the first expected entries for this new initiative with the company is going to be from external development partners. And then when discussing Astrobot, Famitsu mentioned that because there's so many characters in there, people are asking for all these old IP, the revival of certain IP. So when asked directly about utilizing dormant properties, Hermen said, and I quote here, "Our extensive IP portfolio is an important asset for PlayStation. And as part of our efforts to strengthen our portfolio, we continually explore opportunities to leverage our legacy IP as well as develop new franchises." So this comment made a lot of headlines this past week. I'll be honest, I mean, it's one of those things where it's not really all that different from their answer on this topic in other cases in prior years. I mean, they're pretty much always going to say this to a degree, but the actions do speak louder than words. I mean, I think what was more telling even prior to this comment was Freedom Wars Remastered, where we saw a willingness to license out their IP and have another studio and another publisher bring on that older property and do a port or a remaster in this case, right? So I know some look at this and their eyes sort of light up with the prospect of like, oh, we're going to see all these ports and remasters and potentially sequels for all these, some of our favorite PlayStation properties, but we realistically should know that's not going to be the case. They're always evaluating these things on a very specific case-by-case basis. Not everything is going to come back, but it is always encouraging to have them make these comments. I ideally would like to see them at this point do something like Freedom Wars Remastered in a larger capacity where it is being a very open book and just taking pitches from different studios and publishers that can approach Sony and say, hey, how about IP X, Y, and Z? We have a studio that we think could handle the port job for you. Here's the cost. And, there's got to be a financially advantageous way where Sony can now make it work for their bottom line. That's why you can look at Freedom Wars Remastered or even PS Plus Premium with implicit conversions, where they've actually done a lot as far as like older IP goes in the last 2 years, more than they did, let's say, the prior 3 or 4 years or something like that, right? Because they kind of had that, again, 2016 PS2 program on PS4, only a handful of titles. But arguably, it's just they're kind of already doing a lot of this stuff right now, but the modern way that they're doing it is finding help. So getting implicit conversions to chime in and do a lot of the older PS1 to P emulation, or finding a different publisher and studio to handle a port job, and also opening up the license a bit to where they can take it off and ship it on Switch and make that franchise and that IP a lot more financially viable. So, I think that they're already kind of doing these things, which I like. We're still not really in a place where they're saying to another studio, like, yeah, here's a really old IP and you can do a sequel. We're not quite there yet. I'd love to see that happen, though. I mean, they're not shy of doing those kind of deals either. Historically, they've done that many times over to keep some of these franchises going. Just oftentimes you give the IP to an outside studio, and their interpretation of where that story goes is not going to sit well with fans. But it's just we'll see more. They're going in the right direction, and I sincerely hope we start getting some of these older titles that we do miss dearly get the respect they deserve. Now, moving on to the Hideaki Nishino interview with Famitsu, where that was primarily covering hardware, unsurprisingly. Same deal, we'll just cover some of the more pertinent items that were worth discussing here. So one thing that Nishino was asked was PlayStation's continued success and what he thinks was the big deal for the success of the hardware 30 years onward, which he mentioned was probably switching from an in-house SoC to one that is more collaborative and bought from an external partner. So obviously PS1, 2, and 3 to a degree, that was still mostly in-house, but in collaboration with IBM Toshiba, but it was very bespoke. Switching from that to x86, he feels was a big part of PlayStation's continued success. Nishino also revealed that the top reason for buying a PS4 during that generation was number one, price, and then the number two reason was because a friend had a PlayStation, as in if you knew somebody that had a PS4, that was probably the reason why that person also bought a PS4. So just discussing some of the big buying factors for PS4 during that cycle. When asked about previous handhelds like the PSP and the Vita, Nishino outlined that operating multiple platforms at the same time was a burden for both SIE and game creators, and so something like the Portal is a device that avoids that. On the topic of cross-gen and how PS4 is still around 11 years later, he was asked if the same prospect for PS5 is also on the way. So Nishino responded with, and I quote here, "We think that the PS5 will be around for a long time, just like the PS4. However, I don't think it's right to delay the release of the next product that incorporates new technology because it will be around for a long time. The timing of introducing new hardware is related to the timeline of technological evolution and the timeline for us to implement it. Therefore, I think it is important to provide new things while playing the ones that are currently in operation and to expand in total." Another important question being asked here is if PlayStation will continue making home consoles, or if the future is cloud and not hardware. Nishino responded with, and I quote, "As of today, many PS4 games are being played, and the number of PS5 games is increasing. I don't think this will suddenly change tomorrow, so I think that home game consoles will definitely be the core of our business for a while. However, different styles such as PCs are increasing, so we are in the process of thinking about how to increase the overall number of PlayStation users, including PSN. This may be misunderstood, but if cloud gaming is possible with PS Portal and PS5 games running, some people may think that gaming has already entered the cloud era. However, you still need a controller and a screen at hand, and we don't think that hardware will disappear anytime soon." I like these comments a lot. I think they do, for the most part, cover where PlayStation is as a business right now in a very firm but also addressable manner, which is we make consoles, that's not going anywhere anytime soon, but at the same time, we're not going to just go against the grain of where the market is shifting. That's why we're trying to find more PSN users outside of PlayStation hardware. Arguably, the cloud experience is already here, and that's why we're doing that. We're not exiting what we've been known to do, and we're also not going to shy away from doing PlayStation 6 on the same timetable, which is expected within 3 years, which seems kind of nutty and very soon. But, considering what we saw from PlayStation 4, it's very obvious that, yes, we're going to have a long cross-gen cycle, and it's on them to offer a PlayStation 6 in such a manner where it has these key principles and standout features that would make you want to buy PlayStation 6 in face of a long cross-gen period. And I found it very noteworthy with the PS4 comment in terms of here's the primary reasons why people buy or why they did buy PlayStation 4. I mean, price is the big one. We always have to remember, especially with how expensive, say, the Pro is right now, or how consoles are not really pricing down over time. They're still in the console business, even with them being unchecked here to a degree when we think about where Microsoft is and where they will be with making high-end consoles. But Sony is not completely unchecked. They are still in the business of offering a console which is an affordable box, affordable relative to what you can get in the PC landscape or the marketplace in general. But it's still in their best interest to keep it as low of a price as it can be and get more people to buy PlayStation hardware. So that's why I still feel that despite the Pro's very high price tag, PlayStation 6 might cost less than PS5 Pro because it won't have to be, PS5 Pro doesn't have to be subsidized like a new console would be. if that is what they're looking to do, which in theory, they still might end up doing that. But I thought those were some pretty good comments covering where we are right now with the PlayStation business. Moving on to what might just be our final update for this story that we were following for a little bit now, which is Black Myth Wukong on PlayStation. Did Sony or did they not pay for some kind of exclusivity agreement to keep the game off Xbox, even though Game Science already outlined that we're optimizing the Xbox version? We had a lot of people in the press say back and forth that, oh, I heard about a deal, I did not hear about a deal, and we never got a firm, very clear answer as to what's going on, especially with Microsoft putting out statements 3 times in a row now saying that they're not going to comment on deals made by their competitors. Well, we've got a kind of direct comment on this from Game Science where the director, Feng Ji, made this post on Weibo. It was like this end of the year post that they were responding to, and they were just saying that the only thing they're missing now is Xbox, but they also openly mentioned that the problem with the game is running on Series S, where they reference the 10 gigabytes of shared memory, and that it's really hard to get working without several years of optimization experience. Just openly saying that Series S is the issue. But they're also not directly saying we did not take a deal from Sony, just that they're reconfirming what we already heard from the studio in a more buttoned up PR statement on their official FAQ, I should say. So that's where we are. I mean, it seems conclusive enough. So it was a really weird circumstance, though, to have this back and forth between so many people saying like, oh, I hear that it's happening, or that Sony did this, and then the Microsoft statements. But I don't know, it seems pretty clear this was never an exclusive agreement. Not that it really matters in the grand scheme of things. Sometimes Sony does that. They'll fund a project or just pay out a studio, which is sometimes commonplace in the games business, although less so nowadays. But all three have been known to do it, obviously. But in this case, it seems like, yeah, probably was not the reality. Especially given that we have had a lot of studios, some being more forward than others, airing out these grievances for the Series S and shipping games on that system. It is a mandate where if you want to make a game on Xbox, you have to make a Series X and S version. Moving on to a very, very minor update for Physint, the tactical espionage game from Kojima Productions that was announced in collaboration with PlayStation Studios not too long ago, even though the game was announced really, really early. We do have some kind of development update here because Kojima was discussing this in a 2024 end-of-year tweet, going over what happened with Kojima Productions, talking about DS2's development, the second trailer, music production, Japanese voice acting, the TGS event, just everything going on in his life. And he often puts out a lot of these updates, but he also admitted that for OD, the Xbox title, and Physint, they were affected by the SAG-AFTRA strike. So they were doing casting for this game, but that was suspended, and he hopes that they can continue doing that this year. So just a little brief reminder that, hey, this game that is probably very far away, it is still coming. Just, it is, still far away. But there you go. They are trying to get this game back up and running, but they got to do the casting first, which is still being held up by the SAG-AFTRA strikes. Now this one I just had to mention because it looks so cool, which is a LEGO PS2 set, which might end up being a real thing if it does pass the LEGO review process. For those that don't know, LEGO has this ideas website where you can make your own LEGO set and submit it, and if enough people vouch for the support of that set, you need like 10,000 votes or something, then it will be at the very minimum officially reviewed by LEGO to see if it can be a real LEGO set. Now, in this case, somebody did submit it. It reached the milestone, so LEGO will look at it. But clearly, they're going to have to get support from Sony to do this. Just the good thing is that they already have an established relationship with Sony. So that would be really cool. I mean, I don't know as far as like how often they approve these in relation to how many go through the review process. It seems like not many actually hit that milestone and then end up being approved, but it does happen. In this case, I don't know, I just thought this was like gorgeous. It looks amazing. I would absolutely love a LEGO set like this. So we'll see what happens. I mean, there is that relationship, and Sony does like merchandising. So, I mean, come on, you have to think this can get over the milestone, right? Or get over any sort of hurdles that might be in place. We'll see what happens. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And our Tuesday video was the 2025 PlayStation predictions discussion, which we do every year. So I grade my predictions from 2024, see how well I did, and give 10 new predictions for the PlayStation business. Hopefully I do better than last year. And then coming up, probably another upload on Tuesday. It might be Wednesday. I might be a little bit behind on that. Depends. We'll see. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me. And I will see you all next Friday.